wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ NV, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. Of course, we got our sis, Teslin Figueroa, with us this morning. And we got a special guest in the building, 2024 presidential, running for 2024 president, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Welcome, brother.
Thank you for having me, DJ.
How you feeling?
Very well, thanks.
Good.
I apologize for my voice, which is particularly bad this morning, but I have a disorder in my voice that makes it sound screwed up. So, I just want to say that at the outset so people understand.
Okay.
What's the disorder, if you don't mind us asking?
You know what? I had a really strong voice, like exceptionally strong voice, till I was 46 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got hit by a neurological disorder called spasmodic dystonia. And it may or may not have been related to a flu shot.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it makes my voice tremble like this. And and it was much, much worse like a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I went to Japan to get a surgery where they put titanium bridge in my throat, and my voice has been getting better and better ever since. But today is one of the days which, unfortunately, it's kind of a little bit weak today. So
why not cancel all appearances?
Well, it doesn't. My voice actually, the more I use it, the better it gets. So the worse you'll hear it is right now. By the end of this podcast, it'll probably be pretty normal.
Okay.
Now you
Or
said,
at least you'll be used to it.
okay. Now you said maybe because of the flu shot.
Yeah.
Now, so when it comes to other shots, whether it's COVID shot, are you extra careful because you don't? It's a scary thing because
No.
If it was because of the flu shot with me, I don't know if I would be taking any more shots.
Well, I didn't take any COVID shot. I mean, and people know that.
Mm-hmm.
But I never realized, I got into kind of the vaccine injury issue because I was reading these mothers who believe that their kids have been injured by vaccine came to me again and again, literally hundreds of them, and told me they were all the mothers of intellectually disabled kids. They all believed their kid had been injured by the vaccine, and that the doctors were ignoring them. The regulatory institutions were saying they were crazy. But I knew my wife. I had a kid who had 29 hospital visits before he was 2 years old.
Mm-hmm.
He had severe allergies. He was anaphylactic to almost everything. And my wife would know before when he was at the very beginning of his allergic reaction, she could put her hands on him and she could know he was wheezing. And I would look at him. He seemed completely normal to me, but she had this maternal instinct. And it saved his life on many occasions because we were about 6 minutes from the hospital, and if we had been 8 minutes, he would have been dead. So when these mothers were coming to me and saying, we know what happened to our children, I was like, even if everybody's saying they're crazy, I know that mothers know something the rest of us don't. So I was not ready to just dismiss them. And one of them brought me a big pile of scientific studies. She found my home at Cape Cod. Mm-hmm. Her name was Sarah Bridges. She was a psychologist from Minnesota. She had a son who had been perfectly normal till he was 2 years old. He exceeded all milestones. He then got 9 vaccines in one day, and he got autism. He had a classic. He had a 104 fever that night. He had seizures, and then over the next 3 months, all of his speech disappeared, his capacity to make eye contact, to point his finger. He lost his toilet training. He began manifesting stereotypical behavior, head banging, stimming, which is hand flapping, and spinning things. And he got the autism diagnosis. She got $20 million from the vaccine court. And she didn't want it to happen to other kids, so she brought me a pile of scientific studies, 18 inches deep, and she found my house. She put them on my front porch. Then she rang my doorbell. And when I came out, she said, I'm not leaving here till you read these studies.
Oh, so she did get paid. You said she got $20 million?
She got $20 million.
Wow.
For lifetime care, this kid. I read science for a living. I litigate. I've brought over 500 lawsuits almost all of them involve scientific controversies, mainly environmental stuff. Like I brought the Monsanto suit. I brought that suit that is the subject against DuPont for PFOAs. That's the subject of a movie Dark Waters, which Mark Ruffalo starred in, and many, many other suits. And all of my suits involve some kind of scientific controversy. So my job is to read science critically, to understand it, and then to be able to deconstruct it and to cross-examine experts on the stand and make their stories fall apart. So I know how to read science. I'm comfortable reading it, critically. I started reading through these scientific studies, and before I was just reading the abstracts, which is the summary of the study at the beginning on the first page. And before I was, 3 or 4 inches deep in this pile, I was like stunned because I was seeing that there was this huge delta between what the scientific establishment, the medical establishment, and the pharmaceutical industry were telling us about vaccine safety and what the actual peer-reviewed science was saying. It wasn't the same. Mm-hmm. And then I started calling people, and I called Francis Collins. I called because of my name, because my family's had a long
Kennedy.
Yeah, Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And because my family and my uncle was chair of the Senate Health Committee for 50 years. He wrote the budget for these agencies so I could get these guys on the phone. And I began calling them up and realizing that they were either unfamiliar with the science or in some cases they were just directly lying about it. And that kind of started me down this wormhole. But I never suspected I had a vaccine injury. And then 3 years ago, I got this disease, I got this injury in 1996. 3 years ago, I was preparing a lawsuit against the flu shot companies. And I had to go into their manufacturer's inserts where they have a list of all the listed side effects, proven side effects, or suspected side effects. Mm-hmm. And I saw that on almost all of them, that this disease, spasmodic dystonia, was one of the side effects. And I used to get a flu shot every year. And for the first time, I thought, oh, my God, because whenever I went to a doctor about this disease, they'd always said, did you have a trauma in 1996 that caused this? And I was like, my life is a trauma. I don't know how to, I can't think of anything particular that happened that year. Mm-hmm. But then when I read these studies, I thought, oh my gosh, this is one of the listed side effects, one of the top side effects, and that maybe this could be. There's no way to prove it. There's no way to prove it one way or the other, but it's a possibility, and ironically, that this may also be a vaccine injury.
It's interesting because, context matters because you are considered a conspiracy theorist for your thoughts on vaccines, but it makes sense. I mean, based off everything you just said, it's like you have a reasoning behind it.
What I say to people is you shouldn't believe me. Don't believe what I say. You need to look at the science yourself. You can't believe the CDC because they're owned by the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA. The FDA said that opioids were safe and effective. And now we got 106,000 kids dying every year from fentanyl, and that is double the number that we lost during the 20-year Vietnam War. So, it's all happened because FDA conspired with, the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson and lied to doctors and the public and said, OxyContin is not addictive. That's what they said. Mm-hmm. So the doctors were writing, the doctors believe what CDC says. And they got our whole nation addicted to drugs, our whole generation of kids. So what I say is, don't believe me. We live in a democracy. You have the responsibility to do research yourself, unfortunately, and you can't believe your doctors because they're believing CDC. You need to actually say to your doctors, have you looked at the listed side effects of that vaccine? Have there been any studies that actually show that people who take it are better off 5 years later than people who don't? And he will not be able to answer that question.
When doctors prescribe these medications, aren't they prescribing it in dosages, though, as opposed to people who might be using it recreational that get addicted?
Well, when I was a kid, I got 3 vaccines, and I was fully compliant. But today's kids, my kids got 72 vaccines. 72 doses. And what happened is in 1986, in 1979, there was a new vaccine called the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine that was added to that schedule. That vaccine was causing brain damage or death in 1 in every 300 kids. The CDC was telling the public it was 1 in a million. But then NIH did a study with UCLA, and they were shocked. And they discontinued that vaccine in this country. In Europe, it's still given by Bill Gates to 161 million African children every year. But they won't give it to anybody here. But because of that vaccine, people started suing the companies. Reagan signed a statute that gave complete immunity from liability to any vaccine companies. So no matter how grievous your injury, no matter how negligent their conduct, no matter how toxic the ingredient, how shoddy the testing, you can't sue them. That caused a gold rush where, the companies, the pharmaceutical companies were saying, hey, now we got the greatest product in the world. It's a product we don't have to do any advertising because the government is mandating 76 million people take this. If you get it on this schedule, it's worth $1 billion a year. And there's no liability if you hurt people. And that's the biggest cost for every other medication. So there was a gold rush to put all these new shots on the schedule. And that's what happened in 72 now, or in 86. In 89, the new shots started arriving. And that year, we started seeing an explosion in chronic disease in this country. So prior to that, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. By chronic disease, I mean neurological diseases like ADD, ADHD, speech delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, ASD, and autism. Autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 kids today. And you had peanut allergies suddenly appear. You had all of these autoimmune diseases suddenly appear, juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease. You had obesity, go from 13% to 42%. And there's a lot of things that happened in 1989 that could explain that. Right? There's about 11 things. And, there's glyphosate from Roundup, which started to become ubiquitous. PFOA flame retardants, which are in all our furniture, our children's pajamas and everything around that same time. And then there's neonicotinoid pesticides, cell phones came along, all of these things that could be contributors. Nobody knows which one it is. And that vaccine schedule that went from 3 vaccines to 72 vaccines, wow. Nobody knows. And unfortunately, NIH will not study that, or they could easily identify what the exposure is. We know that we have the highest chronic disease rate in the world. So nobody has it. We have the highest vaccination rate, the highest chronic disease rate, but we also use more chemicals than almost anybody else. And it could be, our kids are swimming around in a toxic soup.
GMO food.
GMO foods, right. And GMOs are always accompanying chemicals because the GMOs, are designed to allow the plant to accept more chemical contamination. All of these things are happening, and what NIH ought to be doing is telling us, doing the science. It's got $42 billion. It's got 56,000 scientists it funds every year. It ought to be figuring out what is causing this chronic disease. Now, during COVID, we have the highest death rate on Earth. So we have only 4.2% of the world's population, but we had 16% of the COVID deaths. Why did that happen? Why were black people in this country dying at a rate of 3,000 per million population? And in Haiti, which is impoverished and sick, they were dying at a rate of 14 people per million population. In Nigeria, 15 blacks per million population. Why did black Americans have 200 times the death rate of Nigerians and Haitians? Why don't we have the answer to that question?
It's probably a combination of things because, all the underlying conditions that we already suffer from.
High blood
Exactly.
pressure, heart
It's chronic
problems,
disease,
diabetes.
chronic diabetes, asthma. I think 1 out of every black children, urban kids, has asthma now. My brother had asthma, and he was told when he was a kid that this is a disease. His doctor told him that will never have a cure because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. Well, now 1 out of every black children in urban areas has asthma. And all these other diseases, and of course, blacks have obesity rates. They have highest diabetes rates, and they also have the worst medical care. Mm-hmm. So maternal deaths in this country among black women is 3 times that of white women. Why is that? And it has nothing to do with education. In fact, black women are the most educated demographic in America per capita. So why is it that a black woman with a college education has 1.6 times the chance of dying in childbirth as a white woman of any class? So why is that happening? It's happening because there's structural racism in the medical establishment, like there is everywhere. So. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that we just have the biggest chronic disease burden of any country in the world.
So I have a follow-up question for you, Mr. Kennedy.
And let me just add one thing, because I don't want to leave a misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. There's other reasons that Nigerians and Haitians do better. One is they have a much younger population, and COVID was killing old people. But that doesn't explain everything. Mm-hmm. I need to say that just to not, to say that there's other variables too that have nothing to do with chronic health. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. You had mentioned, you said there was really no proof that the flu shot, did what, your experience, which I appreciate you saying that, because I wanted to make sure that people heard you say that even though there's no proof, it sounds like what you're saying is we should just ask more questions. And then you also mentioned, don't believe you, ask your doctor. So what do you say, or read the research on your own? Folks are not scientists. So what do you say to someone like Catherine Lord, who, School of Medicine at UCLA, that says there's absolutely no evidence that vaccines cause autism, or, your critics that say that all of these vaccines have been safely studied. So to the person that's just listening out there that, they're saying, read the research for yourself, how do they know, the layperson know what they're reading? Or what about when their doctor says that these things have been proven safe? What do they do next? And then my second question is, what would you have done differently if you were president of the United States?
On COVID, well, let me answer your first question. I haven't had Catherine Lord on the stand, but I've had Catherine Edwards on the stand, who is her colleague. And Catherine Edwards, when we got her on the stand, and I tried a case where we called her about a year ago in Jackson, Tennessee, and I asked her specifically the question, has the relationship between autism and any of the vaccines that are given in the first 6 months of life ever been studied? Because the Institute of Medicine says they haven't. The National Academy of Sciences said they haven't. And Catherine Edwards, after a lot of questioning, and finally said, yes, none of them have been studied. So, we need to do now, the CDC did a study in 1999, an internal study by a guy called Thomas Verstraeten, who was a Belgian researcher that they brought in because they were worried that autism epidemic was being caused by vaccines. They looked at the biggest database in America, which is called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. It's all the data from the top 10 HMOs, so there's millions and millions of Americans in there. They looked at 400,000 children and they compared children who got the hepatitis B vaccine, which is given to every baby as soon as they're born in the hospital, in the first 30 days of life. And they compared those to kids who had not. In other words, they got it later or they didn't get them at all. And what they found was there was an 1,135% elevated risk for autism among kids who got them in the first 30 days than kids who didn't. And the relative risk for smoking cigarettes for 20 years and getting lung cancer is 10. this was 11.35. So they knew immediately what was causing it, and they had a big meeting secret meeting in Norcross, Georgia, at a Methodist retreat center called Simpsonwood, where all of the leaders of the vaccine industry and the academics and the heads of the regulatory agencies gathered, and they spent 2 days. I got the transcripts of those meetings, published them in Rolling Stone, and they're talking about how this science is definitive, it is bulletproof, and then they spend a day talking about how to hide that from the American public. I'll tell you, I want to get to your other question, but there's a lot of, because the regulatory agencies are controlled by the pharmaceutical industries, there's a lot of dishonesty and information chaos. Early in the pandemic, I knew Hank Aaron. In fact, I went to Cuba once with Hank Aaron to meet Fidel Castro. And Hank Aaron agreed, CDC asked Hank Aaron to publicly get the shot, to make Black Americans feel comfortable with the safety of the shot. So he went to Emory University at a big press conference, and he took the shot on stage. 17 days later, he died. And I published a notice on a posting on Instagram saying that Hank Aaron's death was part of a wave of deaths immediately following the COVID vaccine. In elderly people, this was true, well documented. In fact, CDC later admitted publicly that people were getting myocarditis and stroke and dying within a certain period of getting the vaccine. So the New York Times then did an article that said Robert Kennedy is a conspiracy theorist because the Fulton County coroner has declared that Hank Aaron's death was unrelated to the vaccine. Oh, I was saying, and that article was picked up all over the world, and that's when I became a conspiracy theorist, and Instagram took down my account. Oh, I was saying to myself, how does the coroner know this? How do you know whether the heart attack that he had or the stroke or whatever killed him was or was not caused by the vaccine? So I wanted to know the test that made that definitive determination. So I called the Fulton County coroner and got them on the phone, and they said, we don't know what the New York Times is talking about. We never saw Hank Aaron's body. There was no postmortem. There was no autopsy at all. The family buried him. And I wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, you need to do a correction on this because the Fulton County coroner never saw this body.
What?
Never.
Are you telling me that they, hold on.
That's crazy.
So they didn't do an autopsy?
They never did an autopsy.
Wow.
But that's what they do. They just assure people, if you're a doctor and you see it happen in front of you, they will take you off of YouTube. They'll take you off if you report that.
I know this interview getting flagged on YouTube. Guaranteed.
Yeah. So, Mr.
Oh,
King,
yeah,
what do
we
you,
shouldn't have talked about
That's
this.
okay. No, we don't care.
Oh, I
Yeah,
apologize.
so what do you say
Nobody's
then?
gonna ever see this show.
Yeah. What do you say then? If 81% of the population has, and just to be clear, I think it's up to each individual if they, if they feel comfortable with the vaccine or
That's
not.
how
But
I feel. That's how I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, want to get some facts out. But what do you say, if 81% of the population has received at least one dose, and then there's some numbers that saying, allergic reaction is about 5 cases per 1 million. I think with anything, there's some type of reaction. So if the numbers are not in the favor, are you saying that because they're not reporting that and they're not being true in the numbers, or are you open to the idea that there is some reaction, but not in a volume of numbers? Or are you just saying we just need to do more research and study on it? And I still want to know what you would do as president.
And I'll get to that. And Peter McCulloch today, who's the most published cardiologist in the history of the profession, of his specialty, published an article this morning saying that there are, and we all seeing these athletes dropping dead on the field like never before, musicians in concert dropping dead, young kids dying of heart attacks and strokes, which we've never seen before. And you look at the insurance industry data, you look at all of the mortality data, and we're getting excess mortality numbers now since the vaccine that are much higher than we've ever seen. So, but the problem is we don't have a surveillance system that can link. So when those cardiac arrests happen, they're not reported in the papers. They're never reported as a potential vaccine injury. Nobody ever looks at it. And we don't have a surveillance system that works. We don't have a system that says that can actually, and CDC admits this, and the one system they had, V-Safe, the COVID vaccine, about 2 weeks ago, they quietly took it down. They don't want the science out there that will make that link in the public mind. Now, let me answer your question about what I would do. And I agree with you that, people should have their own choice. People, I'm not anti-vaccine. What I want is I'm pro-science. People, we should have good science, the best science. People ought to be able to make informed choices about what to do with their lives. If you want the vaccine, God bless you. My wife took the vaccine. Half of my kids took the vaccines. Not particularly because they wanted to, but because it was they couldn't have worked without. They couldn't have gone to school. But it's their choice, and I don't begrudge anybody making that choice. But I think we all ought to have the best information possible, and right now we don't. What I would have done, I wouldn't have locked down society. In fact, we, like I said, everything we did was wrong. We had the worst protocols in the world. We had the highest death count of any nation on earth. So we should take whatever we did and say, let's never do that again. And
you think that was because of the administration that was in power at the time?
I think part of it is the chronic disease. Mm-hmm. I think part of it, and it was Biden and Trump. So, Trump gave us warp speed. Trump gave us the lockdowns. Trump locked down 3.3 million businesses. And, what did that do? It shifted everything to Amazon, which was censoring criticism of the lockdowns. 41% of the Black-owned businesses that were closed during COVID will never reopen. Mm-hmm. A lot of those businesses had 3 generations of equity in them, 3 generations of sweat equity, of currency. I drove through Lee Harvard, which is one of the poorest districts and, urban districts in Cleveland. It's all Black. And it was a booming area 5 years ago. Today, every single one of those stores is boarded up. And, I talk to people every day in the African-American community whose businesses were wiped out and had, and that's what happened. All of the pandemic protocols prior to this pandemic, for 100 years, the pandemic protocols have said again and again, you do not lock down all of society. You isolate the sick. You protect the vulnerable, but you let society function because you will kill more people with lockdowns and do more damage to your society. We shifted $4 trillion in wealth from the working poor and the middle class to the super rich in this country. We strip mined the Black community of its equity during this pandemic. And, how do you rebuild that? Now, that is the big issue for our country. How are we going to rebuild equity with the working poor in this country?
I got one more question about the vaccine. Then I want to talk about your actual run for presidency because we already know YouTube gonna flag the hell out of this. So, but the Barrington Declaration, you ever heard of that?
Yeah, and they say the same thing I said, which is lock down a population, and you look for therapeutic drugs. We have this incredible internet.
I thought the Barrington Declaration was a bunch of doctors who didn't want to do all that.
They didn't want it.
Yeah.
And they were the smartest doctors in the country.
And they've all been a lot of their careers have been ruined.
They were all censored. They were all shut down. They're because they were talking against the orthodoxy. They had to be silenced. They were heretics against the religion, and they had to be burned, destroyed, silenced. And that's what happened. And I think 56,000 doctors signed that thing.
Yeah. And they were talking like how you were talking. So
exactly.
Yeah.
But Mr. Kennedy, and then this is just one last step because I do want your opinion on this, and then like I said, we can move on. I was looking at some information on how young people 20 to 30 between the year 2000 and 2016, the heart attack rate increased 2% every year of that year. So this is before COVID. The diabetes and hypertension and all of those things played into effect. Are you considering those numbers as well?
Yeah, and I mean, that's exactly what I've been saying. We're making these kids sicker and sicker. There's a study that came out last week that showed kids in this generation have 4 times the rate of rectal cancer, 2 times the rate of colon cancer as kids who were born prior to the vaccine schedule. And I don't believe that all of this is happening for vaccines. So do not misunderstand me. There's a lot. Our kids are swimming around today in a toxic soup. The food that we're giving, and particularly in poor communities, is poison. It's not nutrition. It's like crack. It's sugar and it's chemicals, and there's the nutritional value of it is horrible. So we are making our kids sick, and we're making them sick from a whole lot of different things. And what we ought to be doing is looking at the science and saying, why are our kids the sickest kids in the world? Why do we have the highest chronic disease burden of any country in the world? The biggest cost today in our budget is medical. $4.3 trillion we're now spending, and about almost 90% of that is chronic disease. And, and no other country has this. It's us. We need to be actually doing the science. We used to have the gold standard scientific research institution of the world, NIH, was revered all over the world. And today it has devolved into just a mechanism for creating new pharmaceutical drugs. So the research they're doing now is to develop new profit-making products for the pharmaceutical industry, which they collect money on. And they get royalties.
What you just said is why they'll never do any intense studies, because you're fucking up the church's money.
Yeah.
When you talk with the pharmaceutical companies, the medical industry, the food industry, come on.
Exactly.
So you're not saying it's just the vaccine. You're just saying that's one of the, because when we look at overweight, obesity, they talk about smoking cigarettes and vaping is increased for heart attack for young folks.
Of course.
All of those things, not just the vaccine.
Of course. And I don't think it's just vaccine. I think anybody who says that is not dealing with reality. And also, high fructose corn syrup. That is poison. And, it's causing the obesity. Clearly, it is linked to the obesity epidemic. It's linked to the diabetes epidemic. If you're going to drink Coca-Cola, drink a Mexican Coke, because they don't have it in it. Everybody should avoid high fructose corn syrup.
Now let's start with the campaign. So let's talk about some of the things you stand on, lowering taxes, healthcare, and all that. So how do you, propose to do some of the things that you want to, get into play?
That's a huge question, and we could spend 3 hours here. But let me just tell you one of the things I'm going to do as soon as I get into office. Right now, one of the big issues is equity and particularly in the black community. There's the equity. The black community by 2030 will have virtually zero equity. Through a series of different policies, going back to the mushroom loans in 2008, which were tried out first in the black community, the equity, the housing has been taken away, which was if you have a house, you can get a loan and you can build a business. If you don't have a house, you have no access to capital. It's very important to get homes into those communities. There's a bunch of issues that are across the working class in this country are important. Child care is critically important. Good health care is important. But housing is probably the most important issue in terms of building wealth in poor communities. So 2 years ago, the average cost of a house in this country was $215,000. Today it's $400,000. And the interest rates you're going to pay on that house have gone from 1% to 7%. So you're paying 10 times as much for that house you were 2 years ago. I have 7 kids. They're all between 20, 35 years old. They should be moving into their own homes. But I don't know any of them or any of their friends who are actually buying a home now. And one of the reasons for why did the price of housing go up? Well, one, because of the inflation, because we spent $8 trillion on wars and $16 trillion on COVID, which we didn't have. So they print money, which caused the price of everything to go up. More importantly, there's 3 giant corporations, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, which own collectively, they own each other. So it's really one giant corporation. But they also own 89% of the S&P 500. They own everything. They've now decided to buy every single family home in America. So if they stay on the current trajectory, they will own 60% of the homes in this country, single-family homes, by 2030. They literally are trying to buy everything. And the head of it, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is on the board of the World Economic Forum. And what they've said, we want this great reset, which is you will own nothing and you will be happy. Well, they're on their way to making sure that we don't own anything. So you all probably have heard of people who are about to buy a home, and somebody comes in at the last minute with a cash or offer and snatches it out of the market.
Right.
And it's usually an LLC with an ambiguous name. But if you trace that up, you'll find it's owned by BlackRock.
Wow.
And because they have a huge bank book, the cost of money and interest to them is tiny, which means they can outcompete your children. Your kids do not have a chance to buy that home because they can't outcompete BlackRock.
And what in this administration did you see that made you say, I have to run? What didn't you like?
The things that pushed me over the edge were the war, Ukraine war, and COVID. I just saw that the total mismanagement that was occurring in those areas. And I watched what was happening to working people in this country just getting crucified. But let me tell you what I'm going to do, because you asked me what I'll do, so I'll be very quick. One thing, I'm going to try to change the tax code to make it unprofitable for those companies to compete against your children for housing. Number two, I'm going to make a mortgage available to Americans at 3% interest. And I'm going to do that without raising the debt. And the way I'm going to do it, if you have a rich uncle who will co-sign your mortgage, you can get a very cheap mortgage because the bank is basing the interest rates on his credit score rather than yours. Oh, I'm going to give everybody a rich uncle. I'm going to say Uncle Sam is going to co-sign this new class of mortgages and guarantee them at 3%. That will lower the cost of mortgages by $1,000 to every American in an average home, by $1,000 a month. And it will allow them to outcompete BlackRock. And I'm going to guarantee those, I'm going to finance those mortgages by selling tax-free bonds on the open market. So it won't be sold, it won't be financed with federal tax dollars and contribute to this incredible debt that we have.
Right.
But that, and I'm going to give the first 500,000 of those to teachers, and those will only be available to first-time home buyers who will live in that community, who will work in that community, starting with teachers, because we need to create housing for teachers to keep the best teachers in our schools. So that's one of the things I'll do.
Hell yeah.
Mr. Kenny, can I go back a little bit because I appreciate you recognizing the income gap, the wealth ratio between African Americans and everybody else. You also mentioned equity is important, and I thought it was interesting that you mentioned how cash offers were able to outbuy us with homes. Can you explain to me why? I know you support reparations, but you are against cash payments being a part of that package. Is that my understanding?
Well, here's my issue. First of all, I fought for reparations for indigenous people, for Indians, for 35 years. I represented them in many, many lawsuits and treaty negotiations in Canada, the United States, and fought for reparations. And I think there's a clear moral case for reparations for blacks in this country who are the descendants of slaves. There's two impediments to that. One is that, the slavery did not end the structural racism against blacks and the destruction of
Jim Crow, you had the war on drugs.
Right, and I grew up in a Jim Crow state. When I grew up in Virginia, blacks were not allowed to marry whites. I had a guy, a handyman who worked for my family, was a World War II vet. Blacks were not allowed to fight in World War II, but he had been in the Seabees in the Pacific. He had seen combat. He was 6'5", incredibly dignified, smart man. And I loved hunting and fishing when I was a kid. And he and I would go all over the state of Virginia and do that. And whenever we stopped at a restaurant, I had to go in, buy the food, and come out, and we would eat it together in the car. He picked me up one day and asked me to come downtown to Salona, to the little village that's in the town that we lived in, to buy shoes for him because he was not allowed in the shoe store. And so I went in, bought the shoe size he wanted. He tried them out on the curb. If they didn't fit him, he could not return them. And that in that day, blacks were famous for having corns on their feet and sore feet, and that's why, because they were, once they tried on a shoe, they had to take that shoe, whatever they tried it. Well, I saw it. It was 300 years of that. And, that's why I favored affirmative action, because you can't correct that in 50 years of finally allowing blacks to get into college. Also favored affirmative action because whites have an affirmative action program, and it's called Legacy, which is only really available to whites, and it has nothing to do with merit. Oh, I favored those things. Now, the recent decision, the Harvard decision by Justice Roberts, has made clear that any race-based reparations that are just based on race and based on that structural racism that took place since the Civil War would be illegal, unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. There's still, however, an argument that blacks who were subject to slavery in this country could still be entitled to reparations in the same way that the Korematsu case allowed Japanese to get reparations after the internment camps in World War II. After the Civil War, blacks were promised 40 acres and a mule, and many of them were given that promise, but it was immediately taken away from them when Lincoln was killed and Andrew Johnson took over. Virtually all that land was stripped from blacks. Well, you can make a good argument that those reparations are forthcoming. Mm-hmm. There's a bigger political impediment, which is that you need legislation to do that, which means you have to get it through Republican and Democratic controlled houses.
It's never going to happen.
And it's not going to happen. And a lot of, people like, I had ancestors who fought in the Civil War. There are a lot of people on the north side, 350,000 people who died in the Civil War trying to get rid of slavery. And they would, those people could legitimately claim, well, we already made our sacrifice. Why are you coming after us? There's people in this country and parts of this country that never had slavery. And they can complain. So that's all I'm saying, that there are they're just impediments. And what I say is that, my focus because of that has been on two things, which is how do you build businesses in black communities? Because, people are trying to get rid of structural racism and racist feelings in kids by training them. It'll never happen. There's structural racism. It's part of our hardwiring. We are tribal. People are tribal. They look for differences in other people, whether it's race, whether it's a uniform, whether it's religion or whatever. But our minds are like cell phone, looking for a tower. We're always looking for differences that we can make, and you're not going to get rid of that. The remedy for that is an independent, strong, confident, wealthy black community where kids have a confidence and that even if they meet racism, it's not going to impede them. They're going to be able to stand up to it. Yeah. In order to do that, you need banks in those communities. You need flourishing businesses. You need independence. This is what I've been doing for 35 years, sitting on the board of Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration, which is one of the most successful efforts in the country to build black businesses locally in a black neighborhood, and I know how to do that.
Yes, sir, but I just want to do a follow up to that, because that's true. That's one of the things. And I know you went on record when you worked with the tribes saying that they decided, how they wanted to use those funds. And I guess what my pushback here is, one, I don't believe that it'll never happen. It's happening on the local and state level, all of the country now. Some cities are giving out cash in addition to other programs. So I wanted to ask you, are you familiar with the California Reparations Task Force that, put out a study, a 1,200-page study, which included 100 programs that you're talking about in addition to cash, because you still need cash for the down payment for the home. You still can buy a house cash, as you mentioned, that's causing us a lot of problems. And just advocating for loans only, putting people further in debt, doesn't necessarily always contribute to the wealth gap. So my question is very clear on whether you believe it'll happen or not. Are you against cash reparations in addition to all of the other programs as well?
No, I wouldn't be against it, but let me just point out something to you. When a politician does not have the courage to do something he creates a commission. And, it's easy to create a commission that makes these recommendations. All I'm saying here is I'm a practical person, and, the idea of going from legislation that creates these a commission set of recommendations to actually legislation and a remedy to these injuries, if you're betting on that, and you're dealing with reality, I don't see that it's going to happen. And so what I focus on are things that I believe I can change to make things better. And the two things that need to be changed is our education system, which is crippling a generation. It's a crime against a generation of black children, and we've got to fix that system. And everybody can get behind that, and politically it is doable. The other thing that we can do is to build opportunity for black neighborhoods to actually build businesses, and I know how to do that, and you can do it through empowerment zones, through tax credits, through loans, through direct grants, through education, because there's no accrued business knowledge in those, and there's no accrued income or inheritance money. And that has to be made available. So I believe, yes, we can do that grants. But if you're saying we're going to call it, we have to call it reparations, and it has to come in this form, I'm just saying to you, as a practical person I'm not a politician, but I've been around politics my whole life, and I know what's feasible and what's not. And I know that when a politician wants to pretend they're doing something, when they really don't have any intention to do it, they name a commission. I don't need a commission to know how to fix this. I don't need it because I've been doing it my whole life.
So basically what you're saying is you don't think this country will ever pass legislation for cash reparations on a national level, but you're focused on the things you can actually do and get done for black people.
Exactly.
Okay.
And all I'm saying is that it's not just cash, it's additional programs. And all I'm saying is to allow the descendants of those who were enslaved to have voice in that. And I know, you've had conversations with that before. So I just want to ask you, is anybody on your team that is a reparationist, that is actually a descendant of anyone enslaved? All I'm saying is they should have voice in deciding, how we should be repaired, whether you think it's realistic or not. Is anybody on your team that is a descendant of someone enslaved that is advising?
I've got two of the people on my team here today. Champ, who you guys know, and Jamel Hawley. Champ is running as a delegate for me, but Theo Wilson, who's from Chicago and who's really respected civil rights leader, and who's a very, very strong advocate for reparations. And I go back and forth with him. I mean, I have a lot of people on my team who don't agree with everything I say, but we fight about it, and we we try to figure things out. So I have these discussions with all the people on my team, the same that I'm having with you. But Theo is a lot meaner than you are about it. So I take a lot of flack, but I think we're all trying to figure out, how do you make this work? There's kids today who cannot wait. There's kids in schools in Compton, in Detroit, in Bed-Stuy and other neighborhoods around this country, and they can't wait for us to get a slow political process. There's an emergency going on. There's a fire. We're sending $140 billion to Ukraine. We could fix every black school in this country. We could give every one of these kids computers. My wife, who spends a lot of time going into black schools in neighborhoods like Detroit, she was in Detroit recently, and the school that she visited in Detroit had no fire alarms that worked. It didn't have a PA system that worked. It didn't have clocks in the classroom that worked. There were trash cans in the aisles because when the roof leaks, to catch the rain. And there's not a single computer in the school. These kids are, this is not the legacy of slavery. This is dooming them to a life. It's like it's like keeping people in shackles forever. This kind of education. It is an emergency that is as bad, in my view, as anything that's happening in the Ukraine. We've spent $8 trillion on useless wars over the past 20 years. If we spent that in this country, we could send every black child to the best college in this country, getting whatever remedial education they wanted. And that's what I want to do. I want to take that money, back from the military and start building Americans, and particularly in black neighborhoods and without calling it reparations, we can do it.
I got a couple more questions for you. How does your family feel about you running, because a lot of them support Biden?
Yeah, a lot of them support Biden. Look, I have a big family. I at the Cape, I think over 4th of July weekend, there's 107 cousins.
Yikes. Who did the cooking?
I think it was DoorDash.
Mm-hmm.
And my family was raised where we, and my father's father, my grandfather, Joe Kennedy, did the same thing. Every night there's 11 of us. We come home and we talk about what we're going to argue about over the dinner table. And people take different sides and we argue about it. And we fight about stuff. But we all love each other. And my family, 5 of them work for the Biden administration. And Joe Biden's been an old friend of my family. If you look at any photo of Joe Biden, there's a statue of my father on the shelf behind him. Mm-hmm. So, there's a long relationship. They don't agree with me on the war. They don't agree with me on censorship. They don't agree with me on COVID. I can love them anyway. Mm-hmm. And, we need that all over our country. We need to be able to dispute and argue about things without hating on each other. Mm-hmm. And, my family is an example. I love my family. The people who don't support me, I love them just the same. And, I understand it. I have compassion for people and kindness. And that's what, that we all have to learn to talk to each other with respect, with congeniality, without hating each other.
You think Biden, do you think he's fit to be president?
I don't think he's a strong president. Mm-hmm. And I think we need a strong president right now.
Why is he not strong?
Yeah. I don't think he understands the implications of a lot of his policies. I think his policies are, he's surrounded by this group called the neoconservatives or neocons who are very warmongering, who want to go to war with China. They wanted this war with Ukraine. I don't think that they're being clear to him that this war could have been easily negotiated and settled with no bloodshed. My son went over there and fought. Mm-hmm. My son, without telling me, went to Ukraine, joined a special forces unit, was a machine gunner in the Kharkiv offensive. And, I have great compassion for the Ukrainian people, but we are not serving their interests. We've killed 400,000 of them through our negligence as well as Putin. And I think Biden believes what he says about this war, and he's just wrong about it. I think he's surrounded by people who are not telling him the truth. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that he doesn't seem to have the energy or the curiosity to actually look at the other options.
Mm. Yeah, Mr. Kennedy, in June, you had mentioned somebody had asked you what was the most harmful when you compare 4 more years of Biden versus another term of Trump. And you said at the time you couldn't answer that. Do you still feel the same way? Do you see them being equally as harmful? Or?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm scared that Biden is going to get us into a nuclear war. Mm-hmm. Would I ever vote for Trump? No. I couldn't bring myself to do it.
So what
and also my wife would divorce me.
Okay.
Damn.
So what would you do? I guess obviously run for president.
Yeah, nuclear war versus fascism.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the choice? I mean, what do people have? I mean, obviously you're running for president.
Yeah, that choice.
You're giving them another choice.
The choice.
Yeah, the choice is you. But what do you tell the person? Like, what do they do if President Biden becomes a nominee? How do they make that choice?
Yeah, I don't have a plan B. I'm planning on being the nominee.
This is the plan. Okay.
Okay, this is the plan. There's no plan B.
Okay.
I want to ask you about something that people sweep under the rug a lot. Mm-hmm. You had a public issue with drugs, right?
Yeah.
How should we be thinking about Hunter Biden in regard to President Biden?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was, like you said, I was a heroin addict for 14 years right after my dad died. Mm-hmm. I took some LSD. I had actually took the pledge when I was a little kid. We lived in an Irish, Catholic enclave, and a lot of the people my age it was a tradition because we understood that alcoholism and addiction affected Irish disproportionately, though we were more inclined toward it than other races. And so there was a tradition that you would take the pledge, and that you would you got a pledge pen, and that you would swear you'd never take a drink. And I took that seriously. And when I was 15 years old, so the summer after my dad died in 1969, I took some acid. I actually did it because we had the comic books that would come to our house, to come to our little town once a week on Tuesdays. And my favorite comic book was this comic, Turok, Son of Stone, which was about these two Indians. And the week before this happened, they had taken peyote, and they had hallucinations, and they'd been transported back in time to see and seen dinosaurs. And I was coming home from a party where an older brother friend of mine had been drafted to go to Vietnam, and he unwillingly was so there was a goodbye party for him. And I was coming home from that, and this older boy picked me up hitchhiking, and he offered me some LSD, and I said, will I see dinosaurs if I take that? And he said, well, you might. And I took it, but I had a very fast progression. And my progression, I was taking heroin within a couple of months of that.
Wow. Hold on, before you skip to the heroin, did you get to Jurassic Park?
I went to Central Park.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to 72nd Street in Central Park. That was the time when, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a movie called China Syndrome. Oh, no, it's called, I forget the name of the movie, but it's where they stole all the heroin from the French mafia. And the New York police then stole that heroin and sold it on the street. And the price of heroin went down to $2 a bag at that point. And that's when I found it, and it was very cheap and available. It was a preview of what happened when they made OxyContin legal, essentially. There was a lot of people in my generation who were picking it up. I picked it up. I got addicted. I was addicted for 14 years, always unwillingly. I was, taking drugs without my own permission, always trying to stop, but unable to. And and so I understand addiction. I understand Hunter Biden's. I have compassion for whatever he has. I can't diagnose him, but it seems like he may have an addiction problem. And but I don't know what to think about all the other stuff, the Ukraine stuff, and I don't know what to think about his father's involvement and all the aliases. A lot of that stuff is troubling.
Do you think if Donald Trump didn't have all the corruption he had around him, you think we'd be paying more attention to the corruption around the Bidens right now?
I mean, that's a good question. What do you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
If you didn't have a president who had 91 criminal charges or whatever it is and 4 indictments, I think we'd be paying a lot more attention to the corruption around the Bidens.
Yeah. I think that, here's what I do. Because I say, I try not to, I'm trying to talk about issues that will bring people together. Mm-hmm. And so I don't really talk a lot about, Biden's legal problems or Trump's legal problems. Because I don't really have anything good to add to that. I don't have any solutions, and they just inflame people, and we revert into this tribalism, and I'd rather try to find things that bring people together.
Now, so with that said, I'd love for us to be brought together, but I do want to ask, with the recent anti-Black shooting in Jacksonville, Florida, and the realities, what Black Americans are still dealing with. And some people saying that white supremacy exists or doesn't exist or it's a unicorn. What's your position on that? And would you propose an anti-Black hate crime bill?
Yeah, well, as Attorney General, and this is happening all over, and and the police issue is an issue. I mean. Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, on and on and on, all of these people who lost their lives. What is it? Tamir Rice, an 11-year-old kid who with a toy gun who was just, shot down. We're seeing this everywhere, and it's institutionalized. And yes, I would support that. And we're also seeing a rise in anti-Semitism at the same time. Oh, I would support that, but more importantly, I would appoint an attorney general who would make it a priority. That any time that there's, there's hate crimes or police abuse their discretion in a way that, that is racially based, then I'll prosecute them very, very aggressively.
Now, how can people support you if they want to support you?
They go to Team Kennedy 24. No. Team Kennedy. It's Kennedy 24, thank you.
Kennedy24.com.
Yeah, Kennedy24.com and sign up. We already have 160,000 volunteers signed up. We're looking for delegates, and particularly in New York, from the Black community and from other communities. And they can, so sign up, become a volunteer, and do it. We have more volunteers, probably, 5 or 10 times more than any other candidate. And we have a lot of political intensity.
I do want to ask one more question. What do you say to people who say you're just a Democrat in name only?
I say, show me one issue that I am different on than my father, Robert Kennedy, my uncle, John Kennedy. You go through every issue that they believed in and check the box. And that's where I am. I mean, the Democratic Party has changed a lot. I would say I'm the last Democrat. The Democratic Party used to be anti-war. It used to be skeptical of the military-industrial complex. I mean, Martin Luther King, died as a peace activist. My father died as a peace activist. My uncle John Kennedy was killed as a peace activist. We were the party that was skeptical that we should have these continuous wars all the time. We were the party that was against censorship. Now we're the party of censorship. But I've been an environmentalist, one of the leading environmentalists in the country my whole life. I'm pro-choice in every way, whether it's any medical intervention, whether it's, medicines, or whether it's abortion. So, show me where I departed from the Democratic Party. You won't be able to. My issues are the core issues that Democrats have always stood for.
We appreciate you for joining us this morning, and good luck with everything.
Thank you, DJ. I sure appreciate it.
All right. It's Robert Kennedy Jr., and we appreciate you, 2024 presidential campaign. And don't forget, you can go to, what is it again, Kennedy24?
Kennedy24.com.
Kennedy24.com. It's The Breakfast Club. Good morning.
Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.